had a tough time remembering that I wasn't on a vacation for a lot of it, given the incredible vistas and the tranquil, serene landscapes that I was navigating. To say nothing of how frequently those areas in the circumpolar north are visited by tourists. Um, but I had, as you noted, reported from conflicts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, and I came back from the front lines of Ukraine shortly before the invasion kicked off, and our satellite internet connectivity. I lived in a very rural, remote Italian village with my wife and family, and the satellite connectivity shut down, and that was because of a cyber attack from Russia that came at the outset of the war. And I was really curious to understand what other potential conflicts there were brewing elsewhere in the world. I mean, the United States focus has primarily been on the Middle East for 25 years. Um, it's shifting now to the Pacific, but there were other areas in the world that I hadn't yet explored that I didn't think that was in the attention or the mindset of Americans to say, oh, there are other places where conflict is plausible and could kick off. So there were some places that I looked at: East Africa, Sub-Sahara Africa, more remote regions of the world. But I ended up settling on the Arctic because it was experiencing a change so diametrically opposed to what I had in my mind of this beautiful place that you go and visit and get to go whale watching and hiking and eating exotic foods. But it was totally different underneath the surface. A lot of what was happening fell under what would be called gray zone tactics or hybrid warfare. Fishing vessels were, at least in the northern stretches of Norwegian water, severing submarine cables at night. There was GPS jamming happening. There were misinformation and disinformation campaigns that were relevant and apparent in local elections. There was a palpable tension between Europeans and Scandinavians and Nordic nations and Russia that hadn't existed in a place that was reserved for a long time as a place of peace and scientific research. So there was really anything you can see, but there was a lot of things that you would learn about and experience almost through osmosis by being there. And that was the hardest thing to draw out in the book. But then again, I did have opportunities to show more of the visual aspects of a conflict in the North, whether it be through military trainings, which are now occurring more frequently up there, or the ever increasing presence of shipping vessels and commercial traffic. But I really wanted to write a book. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading all the books that I could about the Arctic, and invariably, and I mentioned this in the book, there are three types of Arctic books. There's the eulogy to the climate, there's the beautiful travel log, and then there's the inescapable, geopolitically invested, hard-hitting, policy-oriented take on the Arctic. That's more academic, the last one. But there was nothing that really drew the line to connect me as someone who lives in the Northeast, in New England, anyone in the mid-latitudes of the world, to understand why polar bears dying or sea ice melting or glaciers calving, what does that mean to me? I've seen coastal villages destroyed by weather events that should not have occurred in the north. I think back to Typhoon Merbok in, I think it was 2022, that destroyed the Alaskan coastline. Shouldn't have happened for a number of reasons, one of which is the fact that usually that area is protected by ice most months out of the year, and so rising sea tides would not normally be an issue. There was also a lack of investment in early warning infrastructure in this part of the world because it hadn't traditionally needed it. And in northern Sweden, I witnessed the relocation of an ancient church because of actually the whole town was moving, and the church was the icing on the cake. The whole town had to move because of the production mine in the region becoming more unstable as the earth lost its solidity because of permafrost and the thawing thereof. And it doesn't in a lot of ways, but what it does mean, it means something for my government. It means something for governments who traditionally it didn't mean anything for. And how are they benefiting from that? And what are they seeking to achieve from that? So while woe is the Arctic and so many other publications and climate scientists and climate journalists are doing a great job covering that story, um, governments are in fact saying, well, you know what, boo hoo, but there's an opportunity for us. And that's what I wanted to highlight. So China is using economic investment in different parts of the Arctic, or trying to. A lot of the Western NATO nations are great at preventing the Chinese, from gaining a foothold in the Arctic. You know, they don't really have an Arctic presence apart from a few scientific research stations. They have in the past sought to fund development opportunities for airports and other infrastructure in Finland, Norway, and Greenland, but were or every time shut down by Western allies who said this is probably not the greatest idea and we don't want them here. So meanwhile, they're also transiting the Northeast Passage above the coast of Russia, which is something the Russians are trying to open up year-round in order to facilitate a potential new trade route that would lessen the current trade route through the Suez Canal by 10 to 14 days. But it's also an existential threat to Russia, who is, you know, the country's 60% underlain by permafrost. They have the largest Arctic city in Murmansk, 220 or so thousand residents. And they have, you know, an identity connected to the Arctic ever since, at least since Stalin's Red Arctic propaganda, and also his political view on needing the North for both security and prosperity, given that they have a lot of liquid natural gas resources up there. There's a potential for opening up more mines in their land. So those are all the interests of those two countries. And then you see, as the US and the NATO nations have not fully invested in their North, the sort of antagonistic occasional derailment of a train line that's in the North in Norway and Finland and Sweden. You know, coincidentally, the one that would ferry troops arriving in Narvik from the US and wanting to go all the way to Russia. You see weather balloons from China encroaching on Alaskan airspace mysteriously in 2022, 2023. You see during NATO military drills, a lot of the equipment has issues with jamming. Their GPSs go down. And that had also extended to commercial flights that were flying in the region. So you're seeing a lot of activity that is not easily attributable. But President Trump's notion that there are ships, Russian and Chinese ships surrounding Greenland, is a fallacy. And the ones that I saw were oftentimes on the international date line on the border on the coastline of Alaska. So there is a presence increase up there, but I've never, in the 3 years that I was reporting the book, gamed out the notion that someone would invade Greenland. That there is a great Danish TV show about that as a premise. The one that I gamed out was an invasion of Svalbard, Norway's territory in the Arctic, but that hasn't come to a fore in the public discourse yet. It's just been Greenland. I remember I was lecturing in Fairbanks on one of my reporting trips. I got invited to the University of Alaska Fairbanks to give 2 lectures, and someone came up to me afterward and said, I've been working on my master's thesis, which is really what I want it to be, a book. I've been working on it for 10 years. I just can't seem to finish it. And I asked why. And the person said that it's just so difficult because the Arctic keeps changing. And I said, I can appreciate that, but what I'm going for in my book is a snapshot in time. This will continue to change rapidly, and there's only so much that I can keep up with in a book that is ultimately finite in its coverage. So to be able to say that this book is focused on a set amount of time in the Arctic, 2 or 3 years over multiple geographical visits to nations across the circumpolar north, is what I was going for. I also wanted to be able to, like I said earlier, connect that to people who might otherwise not be interested in the North, or thought that it's just a place to take selfies. I've been asked a lot as I've been promoting the book, what do I think is the future? And I said, I'm not Cassandra. I don't have a crystal ball. I really don't know. Could I have told you that Greenland would have come up in the news as it did. Yeah, he did in his, President Trump brought it up in his first term, but I didn't think it would come back with such hostility and a vengeance. There was a time when I was talking with my editor and discussing, like, well, you read the book, so you know there's a policy note in the back, a sort of bipartisan suggestion of what could be done to maintain a sort of beneficial growth, but also appreciate the status quo in the North. And one of the ideas I had initially was no policy note, but do a war game scenario of how a war could play out, a fictionalized, what a tabletop exercise would look like. And I didn't know if that would add to the conversation. I didn't think it was valuable to the reader, but it was something I was toying with because, hey, people are interested in, like, what do you think could be next? But maybe that's a topic for a novel.